No matter how successful or popular a video game console may be, the one thing they all share is a long list of canceled projects. While many of these get canned in the planning stages, some make it as far as playable betas that are nearly finished. As you can probably imagine, Sega's consoles have had many a game that were either pitched as an idea or in full development get cancelled, never getting a final retail release. And that's what we're going to talk about in this episode. I have compiled a list of software that has been confirmed as at least having started the planning stages for Sega's consoles, only to not make it to a final product. There's a bunch, so let's get started. We begin our list with the venerable Sega Master System. Though I was not a devoted owner of this platform at the time of its retail presence, I did come to love a number of games for it, thanks to my best friend and eventually having a collection of my own. I loved the original SHINOBI, a side-scrolling action game that Sega had planned a sequel for, going as far as to actually advertise a screenshot of it when the Master System 2 landed. No doubt this would change numerous times during development, also being called Shinobi Kid before seeing a final release as Alex Kidd in Shinobi World. Still, it makes me wonder what could have been had the original idea played out. I also would have loved to have seen the 8-bit version of Maximum Carnage that was planned for the Master System. The 16-bit releases were decent, and the Master System didn't have a ton of games like that, so I think it would have been something special. I think it would have been right at home with the bright colors of the Master System. I also would have really enjoyed NBA Jam. While the Game Gear got a version, I think the increased resolution of the Master System could have really made it one heck of a good game of b-ball, even in 1993. I mean, better than Great Basketball for sure. I don't really know of many more high-profile titles that were cancelled for the platform, but of the ones that were, it was Phantasy Star 2 that would have been the coolest to have. As you all know, it originally saw a release for the Genesis in 1990, a massive and challenging RPG that dwarfed most games of the era. So challenging was it, many Western versions shipped with a hint book packed in with every copy sold. Due to the lingering popularity of the Master System, Sega actually began work on a version for it in the following years. It was to come on a 4 megabit cartridge, complete with battery backup. Since the original was a staple of the Master System's library, it would have been awesome to see its sequel done there as well. Honestly, I bet it would have looked damn near as good as the Genesis version, thanks to all the colors it could display. The Sega Genesis was a hugely popular console in the West. Known as the Mega Drive to the rest of the world, it has a massive library of almost 900 games. But even with that level of success, there were still a ton of cancellations and projects that didn't get finished. Not long ago, one of the developers from Factor 5 talked about pitching a Super Castlevania 4 port for the Sega Genesis, complete with a software scaling and rotation routine to keep it in line with the Super Nintendo original. I would have absolutely loved to have seen this. Another one of my favorites also considered for the Genesis was Blackthorn. It was meant to come out alongside the Super Nintendo version before being moved over to the 32X. I think had it been on the Genesis, it would have reached a far larger audience. It was also revealed recently that M2 had pitched an R-Type Leo port to Sega for the Genesis. Leo is one of my favorite shoot-'em-ups ever, and to have had it on my favorite 16-bit system would have been awesome. Super Star Wars was actually fully in development when it was cancelled, and got as far as a playable beta that was just found this last year. The beta gameplay is broken, but I think it shows that it could have turned out halfway decent. But among all the Genesis projects that faded away without a retail release, it's Konami's Aliens that hurt the most. Originally released in the arcade in 1990, it's been long rumored to have begun the development cycle for Sega's 16-bit powerhouse. It was mentioned in a few magazines of the era, though no actual gameplay footage or screenshots exist to my knowledge. I wanted this at home so bad back then. I discovered the arcade version at our local Terrace Triple Theater, and my friends and I played the ever-loving hell out of it. I think with Konami doing most of its Genesis games in-house, it could have been something special. I wasn't originally going to include the Game Gear because there aren't many games I know of that were considered for the platform or cancelled outright that I cared about. But after remembering that there was gonna be a Road Rash 2, I had to include it. As many of you know, the first Road Rash did see a release on the Game Gear, and man was it a doozy. It was a little slow, but it did a remarkable job of recreating the Genesis original. I assume a part 2 would have been based on the Genesis version as well, which was just more of a good thing. Some point out that Kawasaki's SUPERBIKE Challenge is what became of the Road Rash 2 Game Gear project, but it looks pretty different from what you'd expect. Either way, more portable Road Rash would have been great for fans. Because the Sega CD was an add-on for the Sega Genesis, a number of projects began life that were never completed. Some moved over to other platforms, while many were outright shut down. The PC horror classic Dark Seed was in development at some point around 1992, and it must have been pretty close to being done because it saw numerous ads making its way around the gaming magazines of the day. Disney's Aladdin was also in the works for the Sega CD. I'm one of the few human beings on Earth that didn't appreciate the music of the Genesis version, and I would have loved a movie quality soundtrack with it. I think some cinematics and a sprite scaling carpet stage would have been cool too. The sublime Phantasy Star 4 was also in development for the Sega CD, and honestly, I wouldn't have cared if it was a one-to-one port, because anything to get the original cart's price of $100 down a bit would have been more than welcome. Believe it or not, Sega also planned a port of Sonic 2 for the Sega CD to make its North American debut. As you know, they went in a very different direction with an original release the following year, but I can't help but wonder what would have been done with it on the Sega CD. New music? New bonus stages? New cinematics? I don't know, but more Sonic couldn't have been a bad thing. As nice as it would have been to see those, it's Robocop vs. Terminator's cancellation that hurt the most. The Genesis original is a run-and-gun winner, and I think the Sega CD could have offered up a new metal soundtrack, new cinematics to help flesh out the story a tad, and some nicer sound effects to tie it all together. Aside from its tiny library of about 40 titles, another defining characteristic of the 32X is the sheer amount of games that started development and then got cancelled or moved to another platform. The first-person shooter Alien Trilogy was in development early on for the 32X, for example. I have no clue how it would have looked, but I admit I wanted to see it nonetheless. And speaking of Alien, Aliens vs. Predator was also in the works for the 32X, a port of the killer Capcom arcade beat-em-up. I mean, how cool would it have been to get this since it couldn't be played on any other home platform? The survival horror classic Alone in the Dark and its sequel were also in development for the 32X, which probably would have ended up being halfway decent given the technology was there for flat-shaded polygons and the still backdrops. Castlevania The Bloodletting was an exclusive entry into the series just for the 32X, but it unfortunately never saw the light of day. Funnily enough, it's this project that would be moved and refocused, eventually becoming Castlevania Symphony of the Night for the Sony PlayStation. Capcom also had an arcade port of Darkstalkers in development, and man did I want to see that. I love the coin op and was really looking forward to seeing it at home. Sega had a planned Daytona USA port in the works for the 32X, and while no doubt it would have needed many concessions, I would have played it eagerly had it actually made it out. Both Outrun and Power Drift were in the early stages of planning for the 32X as well, and seeing as how Afterburner and Space Harrier both turned out great, I have no doubt they would have been must-owns. Sega also had Team Andromeda checking the feasibility of Panzer Dragoon on the 32X, and I honestly feel the X could have done it justice. The geometry would have been simpler, but the world was mostly barren anyway, so I think it could have worked. Sega also was considering a port of the arcade game Sega Sonic the Hedgehog, the weird and wonderful debut of the little blue blur in coin-op form. This was never ported to anything, so this was our only chance to see it, but after support was dropped for the 32X, Sega abandoned the idea completely. It would have been incredible to see any of these games get a retail release, but the one I wanted the most was Rayman. That's right, the 2D masterclass in platforming gaming graphics. This game blew me away when it made its way to the PlayStation and Saturn, and I confess, I wanted to play it on the 32X first. Back when it was announced, it was planned for the 3DO as well, but neither one ever happened. I think many 32X owners would have felt quite a bit better about their purchase had it been available. Hell, Sega should have finished it themselves and packed it in with the unit. You guys know the Saturn is my favorite system, and like the 32X, it saw a number of big titles start some level of planning or development and never get finished. Among those games were Diablo, a port of the classic PC dungeon crawler. I didn't own a PC at the time and awaited the Saturn release with bated breath. EA was behind this port and Sega themselves mentioned it in a press release in 1997. The PlayStation version made it out, but the Saturn edition fell to the wayside, never to be heard from again. Sega also had a port in the works for Indy 500, its arcade racer developed by AM1. My friends and I really enjoyed it and played the arcade every chance we got. We were looking forward to playing it at home, but nope, Sega canceled it in 1996 with a slew of other projects as it started to realize the Saturn was not its future. A port of Killing Time was in the works for the Saturn as well, and I truly believe this was finished or almost finished because Acclaim began advertising it heavily. It never made it out, however, with even the PlayStation version getting canned. One of my favorite basketball games of all time was slated for release on the Saturn, NBA Hang Time. It was pretty much an updated version of NBA Jam. Same gameplay mechanics, same loud presentation, I loved it. But like many others here, it was cancelled, never to see the light of day. I had to buy the Nintendo 64 version instead. Sonic the Fighters was also considered for the Saturn before it was shot down. I know many wanted Sonic Extreme, but I wanted this. It was such a strange playing fighting game, and I dug the visuals, and I think the Saturn could have done a decent job with it. Sega was also looking to port the Genesis version of primetime NFL football starring Deion Sanders, complete with some big upgrades to the graphics and sound. Many speculate Sega dropped it because they didn't want a 2D sports game leading the charge when 3D games were gobbling up all the attention. But after the rectal vomit that was NFL 97, it couldn't have done any more damage to the Sega sports brand than that. But out of all the games for the Saturn that could have been, Resident Evil 2 is the one I wanted the most. I had visions of 4MB RAM expansion support, additional items and modes, and of course 3D analog pad support. Capcom claims it ran into issues with the port that contributed to its cancellation. I think Capcom ran into a fistful of Sony's money and were more than happy to focus their efforts there. I just know there is a beta out there with some playable areas, and God willing, we'll see it someday. According to many, the Dreamcast is Sega's best console by a mile, but even with its killer library of arcade hits and exclusives, it crashed and burned far too soon. That means that numerous projects got canned or moved to other platforms, many of which just gutted fans of the console. Diablo 2 was slated for release not long after the PC version, but got canned due to the instability of the market. And shockingly, Halo Combat Evolved was in development for the Dreamcast as well. That's right, the anchor of the OG Xbox was actually running on a Dreamcast in some form as late as March of 2000. Of course, when Microsoft purchased Bungie and made Halo an exclusive, all that fell to the wayside. Sega also had a port in mind for Harley-Davidson and LA Riders, a semi-open world racer that played kinda like Crazy Taxi without the passengers. Like many Model 3 games, it was never completed. Another Xbox staple that was in development for the Dreamcast was Panzer Dragoon Orta, the continuation of the prolific Saturn series. While the final Xbox release no doubt would have killed what the Dreamcast was capable of pulling off, I still would have loved to have had it in my collection. I still think it would have been a very good game. Sega was also in some stage of bringing the Naomi 2 brawler Virtua Fighter 4 to the Dreamcast. This would have been a technical miracle had it been finished. The Naomi 2 was considerably more powerful than the Dreamcast, but had AM2 handled the port, I'm confident it would have been a worthy addition to the library. Many more games for the Dreamcast failed to finish development, and out of all of them, it was Daytona USA 2 and Scud Race that I wanted the most. With the Sega Rally 2 port coming out less than stellar, I wanted the Dreamcast to finally flex its muscle and give us a Sega arcade racer of superior quality. Both Daytona USA 2 and Scud Race were graphical powerhouses at the time, and nothing at home was even close to either one. In its infinite wisdom, Sega chose to not even try Daytona USA 2 and instead gave us the original with upgraded graphics and added content. Even worse, they created an actual tech demo for Scud Race, but never took the project any further, leaving it locked away in the arcade ever since. I enjoyed my Dreamcast, but good God did Sega try far too hard to copy Sony's success instead of doing what made them special in the first place.
Temperatures rising. The track is slippery. Watch out.
So there we are, a whole bunch of games that none of us got to play the final versions of. One thing that many today can't appreciate is that the gamers of the 80s and 90s pretty much only had gaming magazines for their news. We didn't have the internet telling us what developers were doing and what was happening behind closed doors. Often when a game was cancelled, you didn't hear a word about it and it slipped into the ether as if nothing ever happened. Many of these projects never got past the planning or proposal stages, which means we didn't even know they existed until years later when a developer did an interview and talked a bit about it. It really makes you wonder just how much information about our industry is lost to time and circumstance. Prized nuggets of shock and awe that gamers would love to talk about today. Half the fun of retro gaming is the woulda, coulda, and shouldas of the hobby. Imagining what some of these games would have looked like, sounded like, and played like is crazy interesting. With any luck, the future will reveal more screenshots, videos, and playable betas for these games, so we can at least see a bit of what could have been. So if any of you have that unfinished Resident Evil 2 image for the Saturn sitting on a hard drive, do the world a favor and release it. You'll brighten up my life, and many others if you do. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.